If you've ever stood before the towering portals of Europe's great cathedrals, you might have felt a shiver run down your spine. These aren't just doors, they are colossal statements, rising far beyond the scale of the people who built or used them. Across France, Germany, and Italy, the measurements, proportions, and designs remain eerily consistent, as if following a single, secret blueprint. How could medieval stonemasons, often illiterate and separated by thousands of miles, create structures that obey the same hidden logic? Some claim lost civilizations or giants, but the truth may be far stranger and far more human. The mystery of universal proportions. If you stand at the foot of the west portal of Cologne Cathedral or gaze up at the entrance of Notre Dame in Paris, you are immediately struck by a sense of vertigo that feels almost engineered. These aren't just entrances, they are gaping chasms of stone, rising 20, 30, sometimes 40 feet into the air. It forces a very simple, very human observation to the front of your mind. If these buildings were designed for people who were, on average, shorter than we are today, the sheer scale seems entirely unnecessary. You are looking at a 30-foot door built for a 5-foot human. But the size is actually the least surprising part of the story. The true anomaly is the consistency. If you were to travel across the architectural landscape of Europe, moving from the rain-soaked stones of northern France to the sun-bleached piazzas of Italy, you would see this same impossible standard repeated over and over again. From Paris to Cologne, down to Milan, across to Florence, Venice, and Barcelona, the measurements, the proportions, and the stylistic nuances of these massive portals remain nearly identical. We have to look at this through the lens of the 12th to 16th centuries to understand why that shouldn't be possible. This was an era long before centralized governments, international standards, or digital communication. This was a world where a stonemason in York spoke a dialect completely unintelligible to a mason in Lombardy. Most of these craftsmen were illiterate. There were no written blueprints in the modern sense, no documents to mail across the continent, and no international authorities to enforce a building code. Yet, the physical evidence suggests that a mason working on a remote abbey in the Scottish Highlands possessed the exact same fundamental design logic as a master working in southern Italy. This remains true despite the fact that neither man had ever seen the other's work, nor could they have read a manual explaining it even if one existed. They were separated by thousands of miles of dangerous terrain, centuries of time, and massive cultural barriers. Yet they built as if they were following the exact same mental template. This level of unexplained uniformity has sparked a firestorm of speculation in recent years. You might have seen the viral threads discussing the Tartarian Empire or the theories that these structures were literally built by or for a race of physical giants that history has erased. It is a compelling narrative because it offers a literal answer to a visual puzzle. If the door is giant, the entrant must be a giant. It satisfies our desire for a hidden history that explains the impossible. However, the reality is far more sophisticated and much more interesting than a lost race of titans. These doorways were indeed built for something bigger, but not in a biological sense. They were constructed as a theological statement. To the medieval mind, the cathedral was not just a meeting hall. It was a manifestation of a divine, geometric order on earth. The scale was intended to diminish the human form, to humble the entrant before they even crossed the threshold. The consistency did not come from a shared genetic ancestry of giants, but from a clandestine, powerful, and secretive professional network that operated right under the nose of feudal society. We are looking at the work of the Masons' Guilds, a group that maintained a monopoly on the most dangerous secret of the medieval world, the geometry of the divine, the secret network of stone. To solve the puzzle of how a cathedral in Paris matches a cathedral in Prague, without the aid of email or blueprints, we have to strip away our modern understanding of labor. When we think of a guild today, we might imagine a benign trade union or a local club of hobbyists. The reality of the Middle Ages was far more ruthless and far more impressive. The Masons' guilds were arguably the world's first global professional network, but they functioned much more like a clandestine cartel. Between the years 1100 and 1500, Europe underwent the most significant construction boom in its history, erecting over 500 major cathedrals and thousands of smaller religious structures. This wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. It was a controlled operation managed by a secret system of knowledge. The guilds held absolute monopolies over their trade. These were legally enforced cartels, often backed by letters patent from monarchs, which granted them exclusive rights to work within a specific city or region. The rule was simple and strictly enforced. If you were not a member of the guild, you did not touch the stone. This exclusivity allowed them to artificially control the labor supply, maintain high wages, and, most importantly, safeguard the intellectual commons of the trade. We have to remember that in the 12th century, books were rare, incredibly expensive luxury items, and the average stonemason could not read or write. There were no textbooks on structural engineering. The knowledge of how to keep 1,000,000 tons of stone from collapsing onto a congregation had to be transmitted orally and physically. It was a secret language of survival that lived entirely within the hierarchy of the guild. This hierarchy was the engine that standardized Gothic architecture across the continent. It began with the apprentice. A boy, typically around 12 or 13 years old, would enter the guild as an indentured learner. For 7 years, he received no wages, only food, clothing, and shelter. Crucially, he was not taught the secret geometry or the advanced engineering during this time. His education was one of silence, observation, and menial labor. He learned the feel of the material through his hands, developing a muscle memory for the stone long before he was allowed to design with it. Once the 7 years were up, the apprentice graduated to the rank of journeyman, or fellow of the craft. This is where the mechanics of the medieval internet come into play. A journeyman was a wage earner, but he was also expected to travel. In Germany, this tradition was known as the Wanderjahr, or wandering years. In France, the Tour de France. The guild system effectively required these young men to move from city to city, working under different masters to gain experience. These traveling journeymen were the human flash drives of the Middle Ages. A mason might learn a specific vaulting technique in Paris, memorize the geometry of it, and then carry that knowledge physically to a construction site in Milan or Prague. They ensured that the code of the Gothic style was constantly updated and synchronized across thousands of miles. They were the physical carriers of the architectural software. The final step in this hierarchy was the rank of master. To leave the life of a traveling laborer and open his own workshop, a journeyman had to prove he possessed the full scope of the guild's secrets. He did this by producing a chef d'oeuvre, or a masterpiece. This was a literal examination, a demonstration of extreme technical skill judged by the established masters of the guild. Only upon passing this test was a mason entrusted with the highest level of trade secrets, the geometric formulas that allowed them to build the giant's doorways. The uniformity we see across Europe today is the direct result of this rigorous, secretive, and mobile workforce that honored the code of the guild above the borders of nations. The geometry of the divine. When we look at the intricate complexity of a cathedral like Chartres or the Duomo in Milan, we assume the men who built them were mathematical geniuses, likely hunched over desks filled with complex equations and calculus. The truth is far more surprising. Most of the master masons who designed these structures could not solve a simple algebraic equation. They were often illiterate. They didn't use the math of numbers. They used the math of shapes. This distinction is crucial because the proportions that define Gothic architecture, the ratios that make these giants' doorways look so hauntingly perfect, are based on irrational numbers. If you try to write down the square root of 2, or the golden ratio, you get an infinite string of decimals. You cannot easily measure 1.61803 on a wooden ruler, especially not in the 12th century. But while these numbers are impossible to write perfectly, They are very easy to draw perfectly. To the medieval mason, a pair of compasses and a straight edge were not just tools, they were the keys to the universe. With these two simple instruments, a master could generate the entire plan of a cathedral from a single starting line. This system is what we now call constructive geometry. It allowed them to bypass arithmetic entirely and work directly with the internal logic of space. Take the golden ratio, or phi. This is the proportion of 1 to 1.618, often found in nature, from the spiral of a nautilus shell to the proportions of the human face. In the Middle Ages, it was known as the divine proportion because it was believed to represent the harmony of God's creation. You will find it hidden everywhere in the facades of Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres. To create this ratio without numbers, a mason would simply draw a square. He would find the midpoint of the base, place the point of his compass there, and stretch it to the opposite corner. By swinging that arc down to the ground, he created a golden rectangle. No calculations, no decimals, just a perfect geometric operation that embedded a divine ratio directly into the stone. This was just one part of their toolkit. The masons primarily relied on two competing systems to scale their massive designs: ad quadratum and ad triangulum. Ad quadratum, or from the square, was the workhorse of the Gothic style. It is based on the relationship between a square and its diagonal. If the side of a square is 1, the diagonal is the square root of 2. This ratio, approximately 1 to 1.414, is the secret behind the structural stability of the rib vault. It allowed masons to calculate the strength of a pier or the curve of an arch simply by manipulating squares. In the German lodges, this was often the starting point for the creation figure, a single geometric seed from which the whole building grew. Then there was ad triangulum, or from the triangle. This system uses the equilateral triangle to generate the square root of 3, or roughly 1 to 1.732. This geometry is more dynamic and was often used for the breathtaking rose windows that seem to spin like wheels of glass, as well as for the soaring verticality of the Duomo in Milan. But why go to all this trouble? Why use complex geometry when simple whole numbers would have been easier? The answer lies in the name: sacred geometry. To the medieval mind, God was the supreme architect of the universe, a geometer who created the world according to measure and number. By building their cathedrals using these specific, irrational ratios, the masons weren't just ensuring the building wouldn't fall down. They were trying to align the physical structure of the church with the invisible structure of the cosmos. A cathedral wasn't just a house for God. It was a geometric model of God's mind, the hidden code of stone. While geometry gave the cathedrals their shape, the actual size of these structures was dictated by something far more specific and far more secretive. This brings us to the science of metrology, or the study of measurement. Today, we arbitrarily decide that a building should be 100 meters tall because it sounds like a nice round number. The medieval mason did not think this way. Every inch of the cathedral had to account for a sacred weight. To understand the scale of the giant's doorways, we have to look at the units of measurement themselves. In the High Gothic era, the standard unit was often the classic Roman foot, which measures approximately 295 millimeters. This was a direct link back to the engineering prowess of the ancient empire. In other regions, like Milan, they used the coudé, a unit of roughly 0.52 meters that was part of a complex local system known as the quine. These units were not just tools for construction, they were ancient standards that carried historical and cultural authority. But the most startling discovery in the research of these cathedrals is not just which ruler they used, but how they decided the total length of the building. This is where architecture crosses over into what we might call mysticism. The masons employed a practice known as gematria. This is an ancient alphanumeric code where letters are assigned numerical values. In a time when numbers were often seen as possessing their own distinct character and meaning, names and phrases could be translated into mathematical figures. This practice reveals that many Gothic cathedrals are essentially giant, encrypted messages. If you look at the plan of Chartres Cathedral, specifically the distance from the center of the famous labyrinth on the floor to the high altar, you will find it measures exactly 352 Roman feet. To a modern engineer, 352 is just a number. To a medieval theologian, it was a sentence. The Latin phrase Beata Virgo Maria Assumpta, meaning the Blessed Virgin Mary, assumed, has a geometric value that sums up exactly to 352. The length of the church was not determined by the size of the land or the budget of the bishop. It was determined by the name of the Virgin Mary herself. We see the same phenomenon at the Cathedral of Amiens. If you measure the central cross within the plan of the building, it comes out to 208 Roman feet. Once again, this is not a coincidence. The phrase Beata Virgo Maria Mater Dei, or the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, calculates to the value of 208. This completely changes how we must view these structures. We often think of cathedrals as large halls built to hold people, but the evidence of metrology suggests they were actually built as physical incantations. By encoding the names of the divine into the very foundations and walls, the Masons were ensuring that the building itself was a constant, frozen prayer. Even when the church was empty, the stone was still speaking the name of God. The physical dimensions were the theology. The scale of the giant's doorways was not just about impressing the peasant in the street. It was about ensuring that the entire structure resonated with the correct divine frequency. The sanctuary of the lodge. If the cathedral was the public stage of the medieval world, the lodge was its backstage, its university, and its most exclusive club, all rolled into one. To the casual observer in the 12th century, the loggia might have looked like a simple lean-to or a temporary wooden shed erected against the rising walls of the church. But inside, it was a strictly regulated world of its own. The lodge was the physical epicenter of the guild's power. It served as a dormitory where traveling journeymen slept, a dining hall where they broke bread, and a school where the secrets of the craft were whispered from master to apprentice. Crucially, it was a sovereign territory. The rules of the town often stopped at the door of the lodge. Outsiders, known as cowans, were strictly banned. To be caught listening in on the conversations inside could result in severe physical punishment. This was the safe harbor where the embodied knowledge we discussed earlier was transferred, where the muscle memory of the trade was drilled into the next generation. Inside this sanctuary, the tools of the trade took on a significance far beyond their practical use. Today, we recognize the square and compass primarily as the logo of modern Freemasonry, symbols you might see on a bumper sticker or a ring. But for the operative stonemasons of the Middle Ages, these tools were the physical anchors of their moral universe. They believed that the laws of geometry were the laws of God, and therefore, the tools used to measure stone were also tools to measure a man's character. The square, used to ensure a stone was perfectly 90 degrees, became the symbol of morality. To act on the square meant to treat your fellow man with honesty and fairness. It was a check against cutting corners, both in stone and in life. The compass, used to draw circles and arcs, represented restraint. Just as the compass scribed a visible limit on the parchment, a mason was expected to keep his own passions and desires within reasonable bounds. Then there was the level, the tool that ensured horizontal flatness. In the rigid class structure of feudal Europe, the level offered a radical counter-narrative. It symbolized equality. It reminded every man in the lodge that whether they were a master or an apprentice, they were all brothers in the craft, equal before the demands of the work. Finally, the plumb rule, which checked verticality, stood for rectitude and uprightness. A wall that leaned was weak. A man who leaned toward corruption was useless. But the most tangible legacy of the lodge can still be seen on the stones themselves. If you look closely at the blocks making up the walls of a Gothic cathedral, you will often find small, geometric scratches. These are masons' marks, and they functioned as the barcodes of the medieval construction industry. These marks served three critical functions. First, They were banker marks. Since masons were often paid by the piece rather than by the hour, a mason would carve his signature into every block he finished. At the end of the week, the paymaster would tally up the marks to calculate wages. It was a system of accountability carved in granite. Second, they were assembly marks. These were instructions for the setters, the less skilled laborers who hoisted the stones into place. A specific mark might indicate which way the stone should face or exactly where it fit into a complex arch, acting as a guide for assembly that didn't require literacy. Finally, and perhaps most fascinatingly, these marks acted as a passport. In the late 16th century, documents like the Shaw Statutes of Scotland formalized what had been practiced for centuries. A mason was required to register his mark upon admission to the guild. When a journeyman arrived at a new lodge in a foreign city, he could draw his mark. This geometric signature proved his identity and his rank instantly. It was a credential that transcended language barriers, allowing a Scottish mason to prove his worth to a German master without speaking a word. The mark was his license, his resume, and his identity, all carved into the enduring memory of the stone. The death of the secret. For nearly 400 years, the Masons' guilds seemed invincible. They were the gatekeepers of the built environment, a multinational corporation before the concept even existed, holding the keys to the most important structures in Christendom. But between the 15th and 19th centuries, this seemingly eternal brotherhood was dismantled piece by piece. The fall of the guilds was not caused by a single event, but by a perfect storm of technology, religion, and politics that rendered their secret world obsolete. The first blow was technological, and it struck in 1450 with the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. For centuries, the guild's power relied entirely on the scarcity of information. As long as geometry was an oral tradition whispered from master to apprentice in the sanctity of the lodge, the guild held a monopoly. But the printing press shattered this control. Suddenly, architectural treatises and manuals on geometry could be mass-produced and sold to anyone with a few coins. The mystery of the craft was stripped away and turned into a commodity. A merchant or a nobleman no longer needed a master mason to explain the secrets of proportion. They could simply buy a book. The democratization of knowledge meant the devaluation of the guild. While technology eroded their intellectual authority, the Protestant Reformation destroyed their economic foundation. The great cathedrals of the Gothic age were fueled by the immense wealth of a unified Catholic Church, often generated through the sale of indulgences payments made by the faithful to reduce their time in purgatory. When the Reformation split Europe in the 16th century, this flow of cash evaporated. Protestant theology emphasized austerity and the written word over monumental stone architecture. The demand for massive, ornate religious structures plummeted, and without the need for new cathedrals, the vast armies of stonemasons found themselves without patrons. But the final, fatal blow was political. The rise of merchant capitalism in the 18th century created a new hunger for speed, efficiency, and free markets. The guilds, with their rigid wage fixing, long apprenticeships, and strict monopolies, were increasingly seen as obstacles to progress. The emerging capitalist class viewed them not as protectors of quality, but as antiquated cartels that strangled competition. This sentiment was codified into law during the French Revolution. In 1791, France passed the Le Chapelier Law. It was a piece of legislation that sounded the death knell for the medieval way of life. The law officially abolished all guilds and professional associations, declaring them enemies of free enterprise. It stripped workers of the right to strike, to elect presidents, or to form any kind of collective assembly. The government effectively declared that there should be no intermediary between the individual worker and the employer. This legislative contagion spread rapidly across the continent. The ban extended to Belgium in 1795, crossed the Channel to the United Kingdom by 1835, and eventually reached the German states by 1864. The legal framework that had sustained the giants' doorways was systematically dismantled. The operative mason, the man who carved stone and held the secrets of the geometry, was legally extinct, replaced by the modern contract laborer. The era of the sacred builder was over, and the era of the low-bid contractor had begun, the ghost of the guild. As the practical need for the great cathedral builders waned, and the legal frameworks that supported them crumbled, the masons' guilds faced extinction. But rather than disappearing into the history books, they did something remarkable. They evolved. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as the operative lodges, those dedicated to actual stonework, began to decline, they started opening their doors to a new kind of member. These were not laborers or architects, but gentlemen, scholars, and philosophers. They were accepted or speculative masons, men who didn't work with stone, but were attracted to the guild's ancient antiquity, its secret rituals, and its reputation for brotherhood. This marked the birth of modern Freemasonry. It was a transition from the physical to the philosophical. The operative mason built cathedrals out of granite and limestone. The speculative mason sought to build the temple of the human character using the mortar of morality and reason. The lodges transformed from dusty construction site workshops into hubs of enlightenment thinking, where men could discuss science, politics, and ethics under the banner of an ancient tradition. Crucially, these new speculative lodges preserved the organizational shell of the medieval guild almost perfectly. They kept the 3 degrees of the workforce: the apprentice, the journeyman, now often called the fellowcraft, and the master. They kept the sanctuary of the lodge itself, maintaining the strict rules of secrecy and the ban on outsiders. And most importantly, they kept the tools. The square and compasses, the level and the plumb rule were not discarded when the actual stone cutting stopped. Instead, they were elevated into purely symbolic objects. The geometry that once ensured a doorway in Cologne wouldn't collapse became a system of moral instruction intended to ensure a man's life wouldn't fall apart. The giants' doorways ceased to be just architectural marvels and became metaphors for the spiritual entry into a higher state of being. So, when we look at Freemasonry today, we are looking at the ghost of the medieval world. It is the vessel that carried the DNA of the Masons' guilds through the Industrial Revolution and into the modern age. The men who meet in lodges today may not know how to carve a gargoyle or calculate the thrust of a rib vault, but the structure of their organization, the titles they hold, and the symbols they revere are the direct legacy of the men who built the Gothic wonders of Europe. The craft is gone, but the code survives. The silence of the giants. When we stand before these massive portals today, we are looking at the physical remnants of a lost human capability. The medieval mason possessed what philosophers call embodied knowledge, a tacit understanding of the material world that cannot be written down in a textbook or programmed into a computer. He did not just calculate the stress of an arch, he felt it in his hands. His geometry was muscle memory, a direct conversation between the mind and the stone. Today, we have gained incredible speed and cost efficiency through modern engineering, but we have paid a heavy price. We have traded the commitment to build for eternity for the convenience of the temporary. The mystery of the giants' doorways is not a story about lost aliens or a covered-up race of titans. It is a story about us. It is a testament to what human beings can achieve when they operate at the absolute peak of their potential. When the work of the hand, the mind, and the spirit are perfectly integrated by a shared, rigorous discipline. The reason these doorways look so impossibly large to us is not because the people who built them were biologically different. It is because their ambition was infinite. They were building a home for the divine, while we are often content building storage for the mundane. The doors look too big for us today simply because, in a spiritual sense, we have become smaller.